group here this afternoon, but that's good. That allows for more time for questions. I hope anyway. A lot of material to cover, but in general to start, I want to say that DNA, looking at DNA as it relates to family history, is all about connections. It's about making connections, and you find this on the commercials that the various testing agencies have put out and such. You find connections everywhere. I'm not on. Hold on. I am on. It's just not coming through. Okay. It's on. Who's the IT guy that... Is he here? I think it needs to be turned up, right? Can somebody check?
That one works. I might hang your mic for a little bit until he gets back. I think he's fixing that problem.
He's gonna fix it. Okay. Okay.
This mic is on.
Oh, okay. I can.
Just for the start.
I can stay with. Okay, this one works, right?
Oh yeah.
I can stay with this one at least until this one gets fixed. I do like to roam around, but if I need to, I can just stay here and just wave my hands around here. That's fine too. But yeah, DNA is about connections, and now with DNA we can find those connections back further and further in time, and that's what I'll be talking about some today. Marty had mentioned that the Brubakers are Celtic. Well, what does that mean? Because when we think of Celts, we think of people in Ireland and Wales and Scotland. The Brubakers were absolutely Swiss, but the Celts actually come from Alpine Europe if you go back further in time, 2,000 years ago or so. And that's what the DNA is showing us. So when the Brubaker DNA has a Celtic signature, it's back further in time. These were Celtic peoples. And I'll talk about that a bit in my presentation today. But it is all about connections. It's about connections between us around the world. And connections are why you're here today, right? Not just for my presentation, but it's why you're here attending this reunion, because you want to experience connections with other people that have a common heritage like yourselves and such. So this is all about connections, but it's expanded broader and broader, ultimately to the whole world. Now, the first part of this presentation, I'm going to look at some documents, and then I'm going to expand that out to DNA, because DNA we can think of as like a document in our bodies that we pass through our bodies. But before we had the ability to test for DNA and such, we just had the paper documents. And there's some interesting things about the paper documents about the Brubaker family that I have here at the beginning, but then I'm going to take that and then expand onto DNA. So you see this bridge here. I think it's been said that Brubaker, Brubacher means bridge over brook, right? Brubaker, bridge over brook. So I got a picture of a bridge over a brook. Now, it's not the right one. Marty had the right one. This one's actually in Lancashire, England. I should mention that. It's not Swiss, but it's an interesting bridge, and because of the Celtic connection, I thought I would include it. So that's our bridge over brook for this presentation anyway. And then in 1717, we had 3 ships. I mean, we do have a reference to 3 ships that arrived with 363 passengers. Some suspect that means 363 males over age 16, and there were actually 500 or 600 people on board. But there were 3 ships that came into Philadelphia in August of 1717. It's soon after this that we have the Brubakers taking out the land warrants right here in East Hempfield Township. So we suspect the Brubakers were on these ships. These ships were full of Mennonite people, and there were other Mennonites that took out land grants all around here. And I'll show you some documentation of that here in the next few slides. So we have here August 1717, 3 ships arrived from Philadelphia carrying these palatines from Germany, but most of them were Swiss Mennonites, commissioned to come to the New World through a land agent who came here in 1710. His name was Martin Kending. He's also an ancestor to many of you. Kending had arrived in 1710. We don't have any ship lists depicting these 1717 arrivals. They were not documented. The only way that we can know that they were here is from subsequent records after their arrival, like these land deeds and such that we're talking about. I have here that the records to determine these immigrants are warrants applied for in Conestoga. This would be what's now Lancaster County within a few weeks to a year after this arrival in August of 1717, and the 1729 naturalization lists that I'll talk about. This is 1729 is when these Brubakers and others became Pennsylvania citizens. Not of the United States yet. This is colonial Pennsylvania. But they became citizens of the British Crown in 1729. There's a reason for it that I'm going to get to here. So in 1710, we have a dozen Mennonite families that set up this Strasburg Colony. It extends from the town of Strasburg today all the way over to Willis Street. It's about 6,000 acres there. And you have names there that you're familiar with. Bowman's, Hers, Miller, Kending, Funk. These are the names of the people. Milan, Oberholzer is in here as well, of the original colony. Now, it's that original 1710 colony that provides the foundation and the basis for the next group of people. We'll call this next group the second wave, right? So Martin Kending goes back to Europe. He says the soil is fertile here. We have good farming. Come and join us. And so that next wave is about 80 families that include the Brubakers, as we can tell. Now, I'm very interested in maps. Since 10 years old or so, I've been drawing maps, even earlier, I believe, and I like to draw them on computer today. And I was intrigued by this one question that historians were having more recently, in that the early records, when Philadelphia was founded in 1682, when they talk about going to the back country, meaning what's now Lancaster County, which would be over here, when they talk about going to the back country, particularly visiting Conestoga Indian Town, where the Native Americans lived, there were other sites where they lived in Lancaster County too, but the main site would be here, Conestoga Indian Town. When they talked about this, they talked about going by way of Newcastle, Delaware, and up what is now, this is approximately Route 41, that extends up here from Newcastle to Gap, and then you cross over the hill here at Gap, and then you can enter the Peckway Creek watershed going into Lancaster County. William Penn took this route sometimes, and William Penn's agents that went to talk with the Native Americans here or to speculate about land here in the very early years. In some cases, it's documented that they went this way. So the question becomes, did our 1710 immigrant ancestors, and particularly our 1717 immigrant ancestors, come to Lancaster County this way, or did they come over land this way? Now, is this working now that I can go out, or no? It's still not working. Okay. Well, I like to walk, you know, but I can make do. So what I was interested in is figuring out, well, what's the more likely route? And the way that you would tell what the more likely route is, of course, if this was all wilderness and there were Indians here that possibly were hostile and such, this route by water, about a third of the way west, would have been a safer route, and then maybe, you know, going this way would have been safer. And maybe that's why they did that in the early years. So the way to tell would be, well, how many English settlements were in this area at various years? So here, 1690, 9 years after Pennsylvania was founded, we have settlements. We have 3 counties. This is Chester County. This is Philadelphia County. What this part would be Montgomery County today. This is Bucks County. We have European settlements all through this area, almost to the forks of the Brandywines. These would have been Quaker people. Some of them would have been Welsh. Lots of English families all over this area in 1690, 20 years before the Mennonites came. 20 years already before the Mennonites came, Pennsylvania was this developed. And then I like to look at this transition. So I jump to 1705. Now look what happens here between 1690 and 1705. William Penn sets up the Nottingham lots down here. Part of this is in Maryland today, right on the east side of the Octorara Creek. Lancaster County is right over here. Southern Lancaster County is right here. We're getting closer and closer. The Forks of the Brandywine here, this is all settled with farms of Quakers and other people from England. Right here's where Gap is. So we're so close. 5 years before the first Mennonites come to Lancaster County, we're already so close. And we also have documentation of some of these early English families settling in the eastern part of what's now Lancaster County, this area here, in 1708 and 1709. So if we push this to 1710, we have our Strasburg settlement here, those first Mennonites that came. If I would add 1717, we'd have all those Mennonites, including the Brubakers, that settled around here, especially up here on the northwest side where we're at today and north of Millersville here. They would have settled here, 1717. So I think there's a good case that they came by land because there's so many English, European, let's say. I mean, a lot of these families would have been English. But there's so many English people already that would have been along this route that they could have got extra resources and such as they needed to make the trip 60 miles west to settle in this area. But the argument still rages, right? I mean, it's kind of a friendly discussion that historians have these days as to whether they came this way or whether they came this way. We don't know, but I think my case is that they came this way.
Is the lower route called the Great Minqua's Path?
So the Minqua Path, they're both called that, actually. Yeah, that goes into some other interesting history. We have some signs about the Minqua Path here that extends out to the river here at Conestoga. They called this the Minqua Path, but they also called this the Minqua Path. The Minqua, of course, is the Delaware name, the Delaware tribe of Indians that lived here called the people that lived here the Minqua. These people, we would know them as the Susquehannock people, where we get the name Susquehanna River. In Delaware language, Minqua means treacherous.
We think you're lying.
These were okay, good. Okay, I'm more comfortable walking around. These were the warriors that subjugated the Native Americans that lived here. The Delaware people or the Lenni Lenape people, I have a whole thing on Native Americans. We get into this. The Lenni Lenape people were a peaceful type people for the most part, especially in these early 1600s to early 1700s. The Susquehannock people that lived over here were warriors and such. So they called them the Minqua, the treacherous ones, and the path was called the Minqua Path because of that. The trade routes were that way. So moving on to some documents. In the Colonial Records that were published in the 1880s, they went to the Philadelphia Archives, or what's now the Philadelphia Archives, and they took out a lot of the old documents that were handwritten and such, and then they typed them up and they published them in these Colonial Records. There's 13 or 14 volumes of these. Very interesting things to go through. Well, you can find some things about our ancestors in here. It's pretty interesting. So here we have a meeting of the commissioners. This means the commissioners in Philadelphia. Richard Hill, Isaac Norris, James Logan. These will all be people that worked for William Penn. The date is 31, or is that 21? 21. Okay, I'm looking at an angle. 21 Ninebur. What's Ninebur? It's November. And it's November because before 1752, New Year's Day was March 25th in the English colonies. In 1752, they changed it to January 1st because some of the other countries had it at January 1st earlier than that. So the 9th month is November. In Latin it is as well. November means 9th month. The 10th month is December. The 11th month is January, the 12th month is February, and the 1st month is March. So you look at these dates, and if you don't know what's going on, it can be a little bit confusing. So this is November 21st, 1717. And what do we have here? Martin Kending, spellings are a little funny, Hans Herr, Hans Funk, with several others of their countrymen, the Palatines, having often applied to purchase lands to accommodate those with them that are lately arrived in this province, and are their relations, friends, or acquaintances, who they assure the board are honest and conscientious people. Okay, so we have that record, and these are the 1717 people. This November 21st is just a few months after the August 1717 arrival of these people, right? And here they are. We have these warrants signed. We have a Hans Moyer, a Hans Kagi. We have Christian Hershey and Hans. Now that's really a different spelling of the name we're talking about here. You see where I'm at? I'm right here. Christian Hershey, Hans Pupather, right? It's Brubaker. It's the Brubaker that we have now, but it's spelled just very different. But this is Christian Hershey and Hans Brubaker, who applied for a warrant for 1,000 acres. This is the land over here at Rohrerstown, or just south of Rohrerstown today, that we're talking about. And if you were on the tour, wasn't there a tour this morning? I'm taking one tomorrow that's going to go to those lands and visit those homesteads. That's the first document there. There we have the date, November 22nd, 1717. And here we have the second one. This is the A family. Here we have the C family, this other Hans Pupacher, or Pupather, for 700 acres here. This is the C family, I believe, right? I mean, it's the A and the C family were the Hans. We think they're cousins. We're not sure, but we think they're cousins. Their DNA shows that they're very closely related. And then we have Jacob, which is the B family, that of course he applied for his land later. Why is Christian Hershey and Hans Brubaker applying for land at the same land? They have to be related. They have to be. They're either brothers-in-law, or they're uncle and nephew, or some, and I mean closely related. Why would they be second cousins and they would do this? They have to be closely related, but us genealogists, including myself, haven't figured it out yet, how they're related. But they have to be related closely. Now this is also an interesting document, and this gives us a sense of what it's like to be an immigrant, because our ancestors were immigrants. So here we go. The first paragraph is pretty much the same as what we had earlier. This is November 22nd, 1717. So when those warrants, the same page where those warrants were, the next page, we have this information, which becomes very interesting, just starting here at the second paragraph. Their request, this is the request of the immigrants here, their request being considered, the request for land being considered, and the circumstance of those people in relation to their holding of lands in the dominions of Great Britain, were asked if they understood, get this, the disadvantage that they were under by being born aliens, and therefore their children could not inherit, nor could they themselves convey to others the lands they purchase, according to the laws of England, which may be in such case extended hither. They answered, meaning our ancestors answered, that they were informed thereof before, however, insomuch as they had removed themselves and their families into this province, they were, notwithstanding the said disadvantage, willing to purchase lands for their own dwelling. Now look at that. So the laws of the colonial Pennsylvania said, because these were foreign-born people, not of the British Crown, they could not extend their lands to their children. They could take these lands, they could pay for these lands, but they could not extend them to their children. The original documents here. So what happens in 1729? Well, these families that came, now, 1729, have children, and they want to give them their farms. So what happens? Martin Milan brings 200 Mennonites together at his house and 2 magistrates from Lancaster, and they all sign oaths of allegiance to the British crown. They become naturalized citizens in 1729. Before that, they're undocumented immigrants, so to speak. But they become naturalized citizens then in 1729, and then after that they're allowed to give their lands to their children and to sell them to other people. Isn't that interesting? So we have all that listed here. Now, some of you will ask, well, how much did these lands cost? And it's right here in the document as well. Because here we have, as it goes through here, Hans Moyer, who's also my ancestor. I descend from about 40 of these 80 families. And probably many of you do as well. I mean, you go back through your ancestry, there's just more and more people. And, I looked at immigrant ancestors of mine. I mean, which of my ancestors were immigrants? Of course, they all were at some point. Well, how many do I have? How many people are ancestors of mine that are immigrants? And it's between 420 and 450 people that are ancestors of mine that are immigrants. The earliest ones are like 12, 13 generations back, all the way to about 8 generations back. The more recent ones would be 8 generations back. But 450 people, each with their own unique stories of coming over in ships, often a dangerous voyage, unique backgrounds and unique experiences while they come here. It's very, very interesting. Hans Moyer would be one of my ancestors as well. He took out 700 acres of land at Strasburg, granted to him for, get this, 10 pounds per 100 count, dated the 30th of the 6th month, 1717. What's the 6th month? September 7, right? Sept is 7 in Latin. August 30th. When did these people arrive? They arrived in August. He had it planned. He didn't waste any time. He got off the ship and he bought his land. He had his money already. He had everything planned. Hans Moyer did. The Brubakers did too, because a month after this, they took out their patents. They took out their warrants and then eventually their patents. But it's 10 pounds per 100 count, which means 10 pounds per 100 acres of land. What's a pound worth today? It's a little more than that, I think, but it's close, right? I mean, it's been dropping, right? Maybe $1.40 or something, right? Something like that. I mean, earlier it was like $2.20 or so. But the one lady here at the first session said, oh, it's dropped since Brexit, right? So it's about $1.40. So we're looking at today's prices. I mean, we'd have to account for inflation, obviously, but we're looking at $140 per 100 acres, or $1.40 per acre, or something like that, the original prices of this land. Isn't that interesting, too? Yeah, all this is in the documentation here with the Colonial Archives. Now, this map's not as nice as the earlier ones that I had. I didn't have enough time to make a nice map, but Sharon McInnes had transposed the warranty maps on modern maps that show our roads here. So this is Route 30. This is Rohrerstown Road here. This is where that nice Indian restaurant is I like to eat at, called the Taj Mahal. Yeah, it's right there. We're down here on the floor because we're in Millersville. But here, this is Hans Brubaker's land, the 700 acres. This is the C family's land right here. And then this, right below it, is the A family's land, Hans Brubaker and Christian Hershey. And here you have the 700 acres. Warrant was September 27th, 1717. Surveyed, they took out a warrant in Philadelphia. They bought X number of acres of land. That's the warrant. They get the land surveyed. It's out there somewhere in the back country when they buy it. Right, I mean, because this is frontier land, right? It's out there in the back country. So after they take out the warrant, they get it surveyed. They didn't waste much time, right? I mean, sometimes this is years gaps on some of the families. But these guys didn't waste much time. They get it surveyed, and then they get it patented. so that ultimately they can transfer it into a deed. And this is the area we're talking about. And then the B family would be these tracts over here that are on the west side of the C family's tracts. Let me get a drink. I should also note, in terms of connections, even though my last name is Martin, I'm a Brubaker with one lineage. Because if I go back 8 generations, I have a Anna Brubaker that married Samuel Brant in Raffo Township near Mastersonville. And that Anna Brubaker's father was Peter Brubaker, and his father, 10 generations back from me, is Hans Brubaker, this A family, the guy that, with Christian Hershey, warranted this tract right here. So out of my ancestors 10 generations back, it should be 512, but it's not. It's 480 some, because I have some intermarriage back there, and you do too. But out of that many ancestors back that far, one of them is this Hans and Anna Brubaker here. And Christian Hershey's also my ancestor too, by the way. But yeah, one of them is this Brubaker. That's the only one that I know of. So I'm a little bit Brubaker, even though my surname's Martin. So that's my connection. We're talking about connections, right? Here I have it listed out, the 1,000 acres that the A family with Christian Hershey had acquired, the 700 acres that was part of an earlier warrant for 1,000 acres that included Peter Swar. Again, Peter Swar is probably a relative. Peter Swar is also my ancestor. But he's probably a relative of these Brubakers. We just don't know exactly how. I mean, these people traveled together in family groups, and especially if they acquired land together, it's because of families, extended families, and such. I mean, maybe a relative through marriage, right? Maybe one of the... We don't know the wife's maiden names in these families, so maybe one of them is a Swar and one of them is a Hershey. We don't have that all figured out yet. And then we have the Jacob Brubaker family down here, too, that was on the west side. Now, you know, I talk about these connections, and we're going to transition into the DNA because this goes back further in time. So, you know, I talked about in 10 generations I have, or I should have, 512 ancestors. 9 generations, it doubles every time, right? So 9 generations, it's 256. 10 generations, 512. If I'm not including this truncation, that, you know, I'm a descendant of Hans Graf about 14 times. So this truncation happens quite a bit. 13 generations back, 4,000 ancestors. Well, if I go 30 generations, which is about 1,000 years, I have more ancestors than there is population in the world at the time. And you do too. So we want to talk about connections, and it's not that far back, right? I mean, this is the year 1275, right? And this is not even 1,000 years ago. This is 760 years ago or something like that. I mean, we're just taking averages here in terms of generations, but this gets a little bit crazy. So even if I look at some of the overlap in these generations, as you go back further and further in time, we already established with my Brubaker connection that you and I are related a few hundred years ago. As we go back further and further in time, we all have the same ancestors. We have more and more of the same ancestors, and then ultimately we all have the same ancestors. And this is true for everybody in the world. Everybody in the world. We'll talk about that. So what happens here? As you go back further and further in time, your ancestry increases, the number of people increases, the world population decreases. There's something that happened here right before the year 1400. The population of the world has been increasing since the year 1400. What happened before that?
100 years ago.
Well, there was a big plague, right? The plague of, I guess it was 1348 that it started, and even in Switzerland this was dramatic. In Sumiswald in Switzerland, they talked about that all the heads of the families had died except for the number of people that you could fit around the magistrate table in the building in Switzerland where they made the decisions, about 12 people. When that happens, and that happened all through Europe during this time, when that happens, I should mention that DNA, when we look at DNA, it has this bias towards survivors. When an event like this happens that a lot of people die, their DNA is no longer spread to the rest of the population, right? They don't end up having children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren. So what happens, when this happened, the DNA of Europe changed significantly because the survivors of this, which includes all of us, we are all descended of the people that survived the Black Death. The people that died in the Black Death and did not have children, I mean, some of them died older and would have had children, but the people that died and did not have children are not our ancestors. The people that survived are our ancestors. That changes the DNA here. So you can see that in this kind of chart here, what happened with the world population. Very, very interesting. Now, when I had the privilege of going to Switzerland many different times. Since 2006, I've been there over 10 times now. But in 2011, I had the special privilege of taking my grandmother, who was 87 at the time. She passed away last spring. Taking her and my aunt and my wife to Switzerland. And we, of course, went to visit the castles and such, and we went to Herzl and in Wattelswil. We didn't spend time in Germany where the Brubakers were in Germany, but the Swiss areas along Lake Zurich and in the Emmental and all of that. But we also went to this place, which was Roman ruins called Augusta Raurica, near Basel, Switzerland. And I just have a few pictures of this place because when I walked around this area, it was a city. This is the Rhine, but this is a city 2,000 years ago, during Roman times. This is just south of Basel, these ruins. The ruins are up in this area right now, but this is the extent that the city was 2,000 years ago. About 20,000 people lived there 2,000 years ago. So when Jesus was in the Middle East, living in the Middle East, there were 20,000 people in the northern parts of the Roman Empire, what would have been at that time, near Basel, Switzerland, and they had this city here. They had an amphitheater, they had all kinds of ruins here and where they lived and such. Right here is the area. It's just south of Strasburg, France today, but it's in Switzerland. Augusta Rauricorum, usually called Augusta Raurica. It's this area that I'm talking about. I walked around this area, and statistically, these people that lived here, probably all of them, are my ancestors. And they're your ancestors too, because our families come from this very area. Here's where Augusta Raurica is, and if we go, this is modern Switzerland, right? Switzerland wasn't even in existence 2,000 years ago. But the lakes and the mountains were there, and the streams and the creeks, and they're on here, right? Right here's Lake Zurich. Your Brubakers were right here in Wattelswil. The Kendings were up here, the Bears and the Snaveleys, and the Graf family was up here in Barrettsville. Over here is Lake Thun. This is the M River, so my Martin family and Longeneckers and Krabels and all those Bernese Mennonite names come from this area. And then over here is where the Amish families came from, so all those local names like the Beilers and the Masts and Stolzfus is German, it's not Swiss, so that's the exception. There are a few exceptions. Mischler, these names come from this area. Kurtz, Yoder, those names all come from this area. We're all close to this big city of 20,000 people 2,000 years ago. DNA goes back in time, long before our written records. What's in our bodies can tell us things long before our written records, what gets passed down through our bodies. Right? So let's look at DNA a bit. And I have how much time left? I have about, 15 or 20 minutes, and I want to give some time for questions. How many have gotten their DNA tested? Okay, so maybe half or 40% of you. Okay. Several different types of tests, several different companies. In terms of types of tests, most people are going with this test that gives you ethnicity. So you take a test that covers markers across all your chromosomes, and you figure out, well, you're 25% British Isles, and you're 10% Mediterranean, and such, right? Many of you have taken that type of test. That's called an autosomal test, and it's DNA that you get from both your parents. There's also the Y chromosomal test, which is DNA that only gets passed through males. For genealogists, this DNA is interesting because our surnames pass through males in Western societies. So my surname is Martin because my dad's name is Martin, and his dad's name is Martin, and his dad's name is Martin. There's a stream of DNA that we can document now and test for that follows that lineage back through time. So there's a Martin DNA signature. In fact, there are many Martin DNA signatures because Martin is such a common name, and it developed in many different places among people that are not closely related. So there's over 100 Martin DNA signatures. But in some cases, I can tell, let's say I meet a Martin somewhere on the street. If they have their DNA tested and I have mine DNA tested, we can tell that we're closely related through the Martin family or not, just on this DNA signature, that's the Y DNA. I'm going to be focusing on that. If you're a female, you can't take the Y DNA test, but you still can find out your Y DNA heritage, so to speak, if you have your brother tested or an uncle tested or somebody that's in your family that's male that shares your maiden name. Then have them tested. Pay for their tests because it's yours as well. It's yours, right? It's the same family. You have the same ancestors, right? So we're going to talk about that. But this Celtic connection is very interesting. When we test the Y DNA of the Brubakers, and about 6 have tested so far, it has a Celtic DNA signature. Now, why is that? Well, the Celts, even though when we think of Celts as being in Wales, in Ireland, in Scotland, the Celts originally came from Alpine Europe. They came from eastern France, Switzerland, what's now Switzerland, Austria, northern Italy. The Celtic culture 3,000 years ago, and even 2,000 years ago, during the time of the Roman Empire, was in that area. And then some of the Celts, not the Brubakers, but some of the Celts moved to the British Isles. So we have similarities of language, right? So we have in Roman times, it's documented that the Celts that lived in Switzerland spoke a language called Gaulish. We have in Ireland people that speak Gaelic. They're related languages. So these people have, back in time, they have a connection with each other. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. So when we look at DNA, we can compare whether or not individuals are closely related. We can look at the approximate distance to a common paternal or maternal ancestor between these individuals. And if we look at Y DNA, if we look specifically at Y DNA, we can tell whether people with the same surname are related through that surname. And we can even see changes. Like we can see, we've had the Zimmermans here in Lancaster County test, and they match some people with the name Carpenter. They share a DNA signature with people with the name Carpenter, in some cases. Now, a Zimmermann in German is a builder of rooms using wood, which is a carpenter. So some of the same family, this is what this tells us. The name would have been Zimmermann originally, but some of this family, when they came to North America, they anglicized their name to Carpenter, and some of the family kept their name kept the German version of the name Zimmermann. Now through DNA, we can tell those families are together. Now not every Zimmermann is the same DNA signature, but some Zimmermans that have a particular DNA signature match some Carpenters. And we know that those Zimmermans and those Carpenters are the same family. It's things like this that we can determine through Y DNA. So when we look at this type of thing, We're looking at these markers that change across time. It's like a game called Whisper Down the Lane. You know what I'm talking about? If I whisper a sentence to you and you whisper it through, is it going to be the same sentence back here? It's not. It's going to change. It's going to change over time. And those changes we can categorize through DNA testing. And we can nest those changes. And what I mean by nesting is we can tell which changes happened earlier and which changes happened later. I got 5 minutes left. Okay. So in terms of history, we can tell what order those changes were made in. Some changes were made very early in human existence because a vast majority of humans have those changes. Other changes come much later, and it's population groups of people that have those changes. And then other changes are specific to local families, including the Brubakers. So if we look at this carefully, we can set up where these changes are and what ethnic groups these changes come from. Now, I brought this in here because this is also very interesting. This is at the National Institutes of Health. I was there actually a few weeks ago, but for a different project. But there's a place there where they have the human genome mapped out, and it's Craig Venter's genome. Back in about 20 years ago, Craig Venter and Francis Collins took on this ambitious project of figuring out the DNA of humans. And it was a bit controversial because should we be able to do this? It's like the code of what it means to be a human. And it was controversial at the time, but now it's ancient history because we have it all. Right? We have it all. We have it. It's right there. That's Craig Venter's genome. And it's 3.3 billion base pairs, these letters that go from it's A, C, G, such and such, all the way through. It's 30 volumes. And then they started testing other people to see, how much the same, how much different they are, that type of thing. We found out that humans all over the world, whether you look at people from Africa or people from Australia, there are Australian Aborigines, or Eskimos, or Asians, or Native Americans, or European people, all these people have the same DNA, 99.9% the same. If I would take the differences between everybody that's tested around the world and put those differences those differences are all throughout this, but if I would put them all in the last volume, it'd be no more than 30 pages of this 30,000 page set. We're all the same except for that. To give you a even more striking comparison, if I would say these 3 paragraphs are the human genome. This is the human genome, these 3 paragraphs. Everybody in the world, no matter where they're from, is exactly the same in their genome, except for taking this period at the end of this set and dividing it into 3 and taking 1/3 of that period. We're all that much the same, everywhere. But it's that difference that we look at when we look at genealogy as it relates to DNA. It's that we're looking at. It's not this. This is all the same. This is what makes us human. This is what makes us different humans. Isn't that something? So it's that piece that we're looking at to determine that Brubakers are Celtic in their origins. Now, I just have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to skip these slides. And I'm going to go back. I'm going to skip this one, too. This is Otzi, the Iceman that was found in 1984 in the Swiss Alps, and we had his DNA tested. His whole genome now is mapped, and he matches some Mennonite families. He's from the Alps. Kreiders, Kurtz, and Beilers are all part of this. I'm going to the R haplogroup, which is the Celts. You see some of the names here that are Celtic families. About 50% of Swiss families have a Celtic DNA signature. And you see the names here. Some of these are your ancestors: Burkholders, Kendings, Neffs, Brackbills, Denlinger, Beam, Oberholzer, Longenecker. And if I keep going here, we'll see some of these other names here that are in the Celtic signatures. There are different branches in the Celtic signatures here. But if I move on, oh, here we go. Right there is Brubaker. So you see a Brubaker signature here. This, we call these SNPs. There are certain changes in the DNA. The Brubakers have this one here, downstream, closer to present. And there are a few other families that have this one. The Mennonite family that also has it is Strickler. So it looks like, as far as who's tested so far, it looks like Brubakers and the name Strickler share a very close DNA signature, having common ancient origins. But the other families that match, my last slide here, which has my bridge over brook as well. The other families, oh, we also have a Gingrich that is tested that matches, but I'm not so sure. The reason is most Gingrichs that test fall into haplogroup E, which is different than this, but there's one that tests that falls into R, and I haven't figured out why yet, but the one that tests that falls into R matches close to the Brubakers and the Stricklers here with this signature. So sometimes there's mix-ups in families. Or sometimes there's what we call non-paternal events, right? You know, and I don't know. I'm not going to speculate what happened there. But there's one Gingrich that's an outlier, and he fits into this family. Okay? But in Germany, we have these names too. Suitz and Fowler. And then we have the British Isles. The matches to the Brubaker DNA signature include these 4 British Isles families: Morrison, Kirkpatrick, Quinton, and Dixon. Why is it? Because 2,000 years ago, cousins to these Brubaker families, nobody had these surnames back then, but cousins to these Brubaker families moved up to the British Isles from Alpine Europe. Why did they do it? Because the Bronze Age was going on. The British Isles used to be called the Tin Isles. And before the Bronze Age was the Copper Age, but copper is soft and malleable. You make it into a plow, it wears out. We started figuring out, well, if you add tin, if you have a molten copper heated up, that it's liquid, you add tin into it and you smelt this, you make something that's much stronger than copper. We call that bronze today. That's the Bronze Age. So there was high demand for tin. There was lots of tin in the British Isles. Some of your ancestors' cousins, not the Brubakers, but cousins to the Brubakers, moved up to England 2,000 years ago to take advantage of that tin, become merchants, and traded that tin back to continental Europe to help with the Bronze Age. And those families that tested today that fall into that category are Morrison, Kirkpatrick, Quinton, and Dixon. And with that, I will close, unless I have a little bit of time for questions. Over here.
One question. You say Hans Brubaker Brubacher was the first in DNA capture? Has that been determined?
So there were 3 that came in 1717 as far as we know. I mean, I guess there's a little bit of speculation as to whether they were here a little bit earlier, but they applied for these land grants, and there were 2 named Hans. We think they're cousins. So the A family and the C family.
One other quick question. Is there such thing as a pure Brubaker based on your slide? Someone once made that statement to me that only if you were a male Brubaker with the last name Brubaker, you're a pure Brubaker and the rest of us aren't.
So no, because this is the reality, right? So we all have parents, and we have grandparents and great-grandparents, and you go back further and further, you have more and more ancestors. That means your ancestry becomes more and more diverse. There's more people involved. Those people have different backgrounds. So you begin to have all these ethnicities in your ancestry. It doesn't matter who you are. You begin to have all these ethnicities in your ancestry. And ultimately, just like I said earlier, ultimately that includes everybody, statistically, everybody in the world. If you want to say your ancestors built the pyramids in Egypt, statistically, they did. You can't prove the lineage, but statistically, like I showed you here, those people were your ancestors. Absolutely.
Yes, I was recently reading that some of the companies doing DNA testing aren't very reliable. Would you comment on that? You know, they're not doing it, they're doing poor work or something, or
Well,
be careful when you get that.
my preference is Family Tree DNA, so it's familytreedna.com, and that company has been set up for the whole purpose of correlating family history to DNA testing. So I found that the resources that they have and the way that they organize their matches and such ends up being the best. And I've tested through all the companies. 23andMe, you get these commercials about 23andMe. 23andMe's focus is more medical rather than family history. So if you're interested in the medical side, you should go with 23andMe. And depending on what your interest is, I've recommended that to certain people. And I found a lot of interesting information out of my 23andMe test because of that. The National Geographic tests, of course, are anthropological. They're looking at deep ancestry in Africa and migratory paths out of Africa related to that. That's interesting as well for some people. The Ancestry.com test, I've been a subscriber to Ancestry.com since 2000. I go on it several times every week. It's a great resource. However, DNA is a side project of theirs. Their main project is getting records online and getting indexes developed so that you can have good access to these records. The DNA portion is something they're doing on the side. And then I cringe when, you know this commercial, some of you that watch TV, there's this commercial about this guy that's wearing this Lederhosen. He thought his ancestry was German, and then his DNA comes out and he's Scottish, so he trades it in for a kilt. I cringe because we find this all the time, that people that have Swiss ancestry or German ancestry match people in the British Isles, and it's because of the migration that was going on. It's not that your Brubaker ancestors came from Scotland. It's that you had cousins 2,000 years ago that went to Scotland. That's what it is. So sometimes with Ancestry.com, Ancestry DNA, I don't think they quite are up to par with that side of things. It's a side project for them. Yeah, that's my bias. In the back.
We just found out that we're related to the Brubakers through Catherine Brubaker, who married a Brubaker, and they lost track, I think, at her husband, but they traced it to her. How did that happen if you're not allowed to have female with the DNA? The Y chromosome.
How'd that happen?
I mean, how did they trace that back to be sure that?
Okay, so if you have a woman in your ancestry, but you know that woman's brother, and that woman's brother has a direct paternal lineage down to somebody that's alive today with that surname, you have the person living today tested. And then you assume that that Y DNA that passed through the males is that family. Now, as long as it's reasonably close, that's a good assumption. But the further back in time you go, the more chance there is that that assumption is not correct. Because every generation there's a possibility that what is in the written records is not really what the biology is, right? I mean, yeah, I mean, it's true. Between 3 and 5% of what's in the written records isn't the real biology. And even though you can prove it from the written records, it's not, right? You know, between 3 and 5%. And you're going to find some of that with the DNA. We find it once in a while. But I think this is probably how they're doing that. They're going with a male that's in that. You have 2 Brubaker families. This one is tested. You're going with a male in this one, and you're looking at his lineage down, and this one matches this one in the DNA signature. So these are both Brubaker families that are, in essence, the same family. So either second cousins married or third cousins married or something like that had happened. Okay? Yeah?
Did you ever find any, in the DNA of the Brubakers, any Jewish heritage at all that would come up?
So what I've looked at is the Y DNA, and in the Y DNA there's not. I have looked at Mennonite families that do have a Jewish heritage. The one that resoundingly does is Metzler. The name Metzler here has a Jewish heritage.
My grandma was Metzler.
Well, there you go. So you can, and it's a Jewish, and the reason I say it is the haplogroup is Middle Eastern to start, but that's not only the reason I say it's Jewish is that the close matches in the signature are people that have Jewish background. So people that are alive today with Jewish background, some match this Metzler signature. Yeah, and they match so closely that I can say with good confidence that 1,000 years ago in Europe, probably in Stuttgart or Munich in Germany, the Metzler ancestor was Jewish 1,000 years ago. They matched that closely. So not only does the Metzler line come from the Middle East, come from Israel, they remained Jewish when they came into Europe, to Germany, and sometime maybe 1,000 years ago or 800 years ago, they became Christian and then ultimately became Mennonite. I don't know how or why that happened, but the DNA certainly shows that the Metzler family was Jewish. The other family, I tested 300 families. There are not many that are Jewish that I've tested, but the Metzlers definitely are. And the Rapogel family, which is a brethren family from out in western Pennsylvania, Rapogel, also has this Jewish. The Metzlers and Rapogels are not real closely related, but they are part of the same J haplogroup, and their matches are Jewish people. That's really the thing. Their matches. There are other families that come from the Middle East. The Hollingers come from the Middle East in their signature, but they don't match Jewish families, so I don't think they were Jewish. But these two families that have Mennonite or Pennsylvania Mennonite and Brethren background match Jewish people in the databases. So that means they're Jewish in their ancestry. Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? Yes, one other question.
I'm in the B line.
Yeah.
And when I had mine tested, it came back that I was in haplogroup T.
Okay, that's when you tested, so it's the mitochondrial DNA that you tested. So it's the mother's line back. And haplogroup T on the mother's line is a whole different ancestry than haplogroup T on the father's line. So you can't correlate. It's either mitochondrial DNA haplogroup T or Y DNA haplogroup T. That gets a bit confusing, but it's two separate lineages. And I am also, for the record, I am also mitochondrial DNA haplogroup T. But my Y DNA is haplogroup I. Yeah. Okay. With that I'll close. But I'll stay on if you have individual questions and want to talk to me a bit.